Dr. James Calloway performed emergency surgery in a hospital cafeteria using only a pocket knife and a ballpoint pen, saving a man's life when no one else could. The medical staff called it heroic. The patient called it a miracle. The hospital administration called it grounds for termination. In just 24 hours, Dr. Calloway went from saving a dying patient to watching his medical license being crushed in the fist of a vengeful hospital administrator. But in a medical system where protocols sometimes matter more than patients, why would the act of saving a life destroy a brilliant surgeon's career? And what dark secret might a powerful hospital administrator be desperate to keep buried beneath mountains of bureaucracy and red tape? Dr. James Calloway wasn't always relegated to research labs and administrative paperwork. At 38, he had once been Memorial General's most celebrated cardiovascular surgeon, with patients traveling from across the country for his innovative techniques. His dark, expressive eyes, now often downcast in the hospital corridors, had once sparkled with confidence during the most challenging procedures. His wall of accolades told the story, pioneering minimally invasive procedures, teaching at the medical school, saving cases other surgeons deemed hopeless. For nearly a decade, James had been the hospital's golden boy. Administrators showcased him during donor meetings. Medical students competed fiercely for rotations on his service. His research papers were published in prestigious journals. His name was whispered with reverence in hospital corridors. Calloway could save anyone. His hands were considered nothing short of miraculous, steady, precise, and guided by an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. He doesn't just see anatomy, a colleague once remarked during a particularly complex aortic dissection. He sees possibilities the rest of us miss. But those same colleagues noticed the subtle shift 3 years ago. The legendary surgeon began refusing complex cases, spending more time in research, his hands no longer steady during department meetings. The whispers in hospital corridors transformed. Burnout, some said. Lost his nerve, others suggested. Did you see him turn down the Henderson case? The old Calloway would have taken it in a heartbeat. His abrupt withdrawal from surgery had sparked rampant speculation. Some said he'd developed an addiction to prescription medications, a common enough affliction among high-stress surgeons. Others suggested a personal tragedy had shaken his confidence. The more charitable ones theorized he was simply focusing on an important research breakthrough. None guessed the truth. What few knew was the real story behind his self-imposed exile from the operating room. During a high-risk procedure on Margaret Grayson, wife of hospital administrator Richard Grayson, an unexpected complication arose. Despite James's frantic efforts, Margaret died on his table. Though the subsequent review found no negligence, something changed inside him that day. The loss of a patient wasn't uncommon in his field. Cardiovascular surgery, by its nature, involved the highest-risk patients. James had lost patients before, had sat with grieving families, had questioned his decisions, had carried their names in his heart. But Margaret's case was different. The truth was more complex than hospital gossip suggested. James had noticed irregularities in Margaret's preoperative blood work but had been pressured by Richard Grayson, a stern, silver-haired man in his late 50s with an intimidating presence, to proceed with surgery despite his concerns. "My wife needs this procedure now, not after another week of tests," Grayson had insisted, pulling rank. "We've already postponed twice. I won't have her suffering any longer." James had acquiesced, though his instincts screamed caution. During the procedure, Margaret's unusual reaction to the anesthesia, the very issue James had wanted to investigate further, triggered a cascade of complications. He fought for hours to save her, trying every technique at his disposal, but ultimately lost the battle. In the aftermath, as he struggled with the guilt of ignoring his instincts, James discovered something disturbing. Reviewing Margaret's case file, he found his surgical notes had been altered in the hospital records, subtle changes suggesting he had overlooked warning signs. Documentation of his request for additional testing was missing. Notes about his conversation with Grayson had disappeared entirely. Though he suspected Grayson's involvement, he had no proof, and the grief-stricken administrator was now his direct superior. Rather than fight, James requested reassignment to research, where he'd spent the last 3 years in professional purgatory, his crisp white lab coat a poor substitute for the surgical gown that had once felt like a second skin. The decision had cost him more than his professional standing. His fiancée, unable to understand his withdrawal from the career he loved, had eventually left. His circle of friends, mostly fellow surgeons, had gradually drifted away as he declined social invitations and stopped attending medical conferences. His world had contracted to the four walls of his research lab, where he conducted experiments that felt hollow compared to the life-and-death drama of surgery. His new daily reality was a careful dance of avoiding Grayson in hallways and enduring the pitying glances of nurses who once assisted in his groundbreaking surgeries. He took his lunch at odd hours to avoid the busy cafeteria where colleagues might attempt conversation. He parked in the farthest corner of the lot, entering through side doors. He had become a ghost in the hospital where he had once been a legend. The promising career that had defined his life now seemed irrevocably broken, until fate forced his hand in the most public way possible. Tuesday's cafeteria special was meatloaf, a detail James would always remember, because that ordinary lunch break was about to shatter his carefully constructed isolation. He'd chosen to eat later than usual, hoping to avoid the midday rush. The cafeteria was half empty, just as he preferred it. James sat alone at a corner table, research papers spread before him, a barely touched sandwich on his tray. The latest journal article on experimental cardiac regeneration techniques should have captivated him, but he found his attention wandering to the surgery schedule posted on the bulletin board nearby. Force of habit, checking who was handling the cases that might once have been his. Dr. Kaplan had the ventricular septal repair. A relatively straightforward procedure, but Kaplan sometimes struggled with post-bypass bleeding. Dr. Rodriguez had the thoracic aortic aneurysm, a challenging case James would have relished 3 years ago. Now, he forced his eyes back to his research papers, focusing on data that suddenly seemed meaningless. 3 tables away, Walter Simmons, a 62-year-old retired high school principal with type 2 diabetes and a distinguished career in the Marines before education, was having lunch with his wife Susan. Walter was visiting for his wife's oncology appointment. Her breast cancer, caught early, had responded well to treatment. After her encouraging prognosis meeting, they had come down to celebrate with lunch in the hospital cafeteria. "To 5 years cancer-free," Walter said, raising his paper cup of apple juice in a toast to his wife of 40 years. Susan smiled, clinking her cup against his. "And to that retirement trip to Italy we've been putting off." Walter took a generous bite of his turkey club sandwich. James, without meaning to, observed the older couple's celebration from the corner of his eye, feeling a twinge of something like nostalgia for a life he might have had. Then everything changed. Walter's face suddenly contorted. His hand flew to his throat, the universal sign of choking. The half-chewed bite of sandwich was lodged in his airway. "Walter!" Susan's voice rose in alarm. "Walter, what's wrong?" A cafeteria worker, Maria from the salad station, rushed over, attempting the Heimlich maneuver without success. A nurse on her lunch break, Tanya from pediatrics, joined the effort, but Walter's condition rapidly deteriorated. His face turned from red to purple. More alarming to James's trained eye was the rapid swelling visible around Walter's neck, signs of a severe allergic reaction. "Something's wrong," Tanya said, panic edging her voice. "This isn't just choking. Call a code blue," Maria shouted to the cashier, who was already reaching for the phone. James set down his research paper, his surgeon's mind automatically calculating the unfolding emergency. He knew the hospital's trauma team was responding to a multi-car pileup that had arrived just 20 minutes earlier. He'd seen the commotion from his research lab window, had heard the overhead announcement calling for additional personnel to report to the ER. Walter collapsed to the linoleum floor, his body now convulsing. The sandwich fragment had been dislodged by the Heimlich attempts, but his throat was closing from what appeared to be anaphylaxis. Susan Simmons screamed, "Someone help him! Please, he can't breathe." Hospital security arrived, 2 guards in blue uniforms radioing desperately for medical assistance. "Trauma team is tied up with accident victims," came the crackling response. "ETA 4 minutes." James calculated rapidly. his mind suddenly clearer than it had been in years. For minutes was too long. Walter would suffer brain death within 3 minutes without oxygen. The man's throat was closing from anaphylaxis. The sandwich likely contained an allergen. The Heimlich wouldn't help. His airway was swelling shut. He needed epinephrine and an emergency airway. A young resident James recognized from the cardiology department, Dr. Rebecca Chun, appeared at the edge of the growing crowd, emergency kit in hand. She knelt beside Walter but froze at the severity of the situation, her face pale. "He needs a cricothyrotomy," she said, looking up frantically. "I've never performed an emergency tracheostomy outside of simulation lab. I don't know if I can." In that moment, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, absolute clarity. The paralysis of doubt that had haunted him since Margaret Grayson's death evaporated in an instant. There was only this moment, this patient, and the unmistakable knowledge of what needed to be done. "I have," James said, standing. The crowd parted as he approached and knelt beside Walter's now blue-tinged face. "We don't have time to move him to the ER. We do this now or he dies." The cafeteria fell silent as James took command. "I need space. Move these tables back. Someone find me alcohol wipes, a first aid kit if there's one nearby." His voice carried the authority that had once made him a legend in the operating theater. A tone he hadn't used in 3 years, but which came back instinctively in this crisis. The cafeteria staff and nearby diners scrambled to comply, pushing tables and chairs back to create a makeshift operating area. The floor manager, a thin man named Hector, called out, "First aid kit behind the counter." The resident, Dr. Rebecca Chin, responded to his tone instantly. "I have alcohol wipes in my kit, sir." She dropped to her knees beside him. Emergency kit already open, her earlier hesitation replaced by focus now that someone else had taken charge. James removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. His hands, which had trembled during research presentations for 3 years, were now rock steady. "Get me the sharpest knife from the kitchen." "We don't have proper equipment," Chen protested, though she was already clearing space around Walter's now unconscious form. "The ER team will be here soon." "Not soon enough," James replied, sanitizing his hands with alcohol wipes. His eyes met Chen's. "His throat is closing. He won't last 4 minutes." He turned to Susan Simmons, whose tear-streaked face registered both terror and hope. "Mrs. Simmons, your husband is experiencing anaphylactic shock. His airway is closed. I need to create an emergency breathing passage in his throat. Without it, he'll die before help arrives. Do I have your permission?" Susan clutched Walter's limp hand. Her lips moved in silent prayer before she whispered, "Please save him." A cafeteria worker returned with a knife. James examined it, finding its point too dull for the delicate procedure. He reached into his pocket and removed a Swiss Army knife he carried since his camping days with his father, a habit he'd never broken even as he'd moved from rural Pennsylvania to medical school to the surgical elite. He unfolded the blade and carefully sanitized it with alcohol. "I need something hollow, tubular. A straw would work, but something sturdier." His eyes scanned the crowded cafeteria, evaluating and discarding possibilities. Rebecca Chin held up a ballpoint pen. "Would this work? I can disassemble it." James nodded, continuing his preparations as she removed the ink cartridge and mouthpiece, creating a hollow tube. "Perfect. Sanitize it thoroughly with the remaining alcohol wipes." The crowd around them had grown. Some hospital staff recognized James, the fallen surgical star now apparently attempting an emergency procedure in the most unlikely of settings. Several workers turned away, unwilling to watch. 2 security guards filmed with their phones, one out of shock, the other recognizing the potential need for documentation. Walter's oxygen-deprived body had stopped convulsing and was now terrifyingly still, his lips a dusky blue. There was no time for further deliberation. "Hold his shoulders," James instructed Chun. "Keep his head tilted back and neck extended." With precise movements that belied his 3-year absence from surgery, James located the cricothyroid membrane in Walter's throat, the small depression between the thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage, the safest entry point for an emergency airway. Beginning incision, he announced, as if in an operating theater with a full surgical team instead of a hospital cafeteria surrounded by shocked onlookers. The terminology, the procedures, the calm focus, it all came back to him like muscle memory. James took a breath, steadying his hand, the same hand that had trembled during department meetings for 3 years, and made a decisive horizontal incision, approximately 1.5 centimeters wide and just deep enough to reach the membrane. Blood appeared, but less than the gathered crowd expected due to his precision. "Suction," he said automatically, then caught himself. "I need something to blot the blood." Chun handed him napkins from a nearby dispenser. James used them to clear his field of vision, then made a second vertical incision through the membrane itself, careful to avoid nearby blood vessels. With methodical efficiency, he created a small opening into the trachea and inserted the makeshift breathing tube, securing it with medical tape from Chen's emergency kit and stabilizing it with folded napkins on either side. For 2 heartbeats, nothing happened. The crowd held its collective breath. Then a whistle of air through the improvised airway broke the silence. Color slowly returned to Walter's face, the deathly blue receding. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. "We need epinephrine," James said, checking Walter's pulse. "Does your kit have an EpiPen?" Chun nodded, producing the auto-injector. James administered it with practiced ease, delivering the life-saving medication that would begin reducing the allergic swelling. "Keep him stabilized. Trauma team should be here any moment," James said, his voice now quieter as the immediate crisis passed. He remained kneeling beside Walter, monitoring his vital signs by touch and observation, his white shirt now stained with blood. The research papers he'd been reviewing were scattered across the floor, forgotten. Someone in the crowd began to applaud. The sound spread, growing louder, punctuated by exclamations of "amazing" and "did you see that?" James ignored it all, focused entirely on his patient. But in that moment, something inside him that had been broken for 3 years began to heal. The certainty, the purpose, the knowledge that his hands could still save lives. It flooded back, washing away years of doubt in an instant. The trauma team burst into the cafeteria 4 minutes later, led by Dr. Kaplan, who had abandoned his scheduled surgery to another attending when the code blue was called. They stopped short at the scene before them. Walter Simmons lay stable on the floor, breathing through a ballpoint pen protruding from his throat, attended by a blood-spattered researcher and a wide-eyed resident. A circle of onlookers, some filming with their phones, others simply staring in amazement, surrounded the makeshift surgical theater. "What the hell?" Dr. Kaplan muttered, then snapped back to professional mode, directing his team forward with practiced efficiency. "Severe anaphylaxis with complete airway obstruction," James reported clinically, shifting seamlessly into the medical terminology that had once been his daily language. Emergency cricothyrotomy performed with improvised materials at approximately 1:22 p.m. Patient received 0.3 milligrams epinephrine at 1:24. Pulse is 104, weak but regular. Oxygen saturation unknown but improving based on color. Patient is stable but needs proper intubation and anaphylaxis treatment. The lead trauma doctor, Dr. Kaplan, recognized James instantly despite not having worked with him in years. "Calloway? You did this." He knelt to examine the improvisation with professional appreciation, carefully inspecting the placement of the makeshift breathing tube. Textbook placement. "Let's get him to the ICU." The trauma team worked efficiently, transitioning Walter to proper medical equipment. An anesthesiologist established a more permanent airway while a nurse started in 4 for additional medications. As they transferred Walter to a gurney, Dr. Chun pulled Kaplan aside, her voice low but urgent. "Dr. Calloway saved his life," she insisted. "We had nothing, no proper equipment, no surgical tray. He used a pocket knife and a pen. The patient was in full anaphylactic shock, his airway completely closed. He would have died before your team arrived. Would you have attempted this procedure?" Kaplan asked her, his expression serious. Chun shook her head. "I wouldn't have known where to start. I've never performed a cricothyrotomy outside simulation." He was completely calm, completely certain, like watching a masterclass in emergency medicine. Kaplan glanced back at James, who was speaking quietly with Susan Simmons, explaining what would happen next as her husband was transferred to intensive care. "That's the Calloway I remember," he said almost to himself. "Before the Grayson case." Word of the cafeteria surgery spread through Memorial General like wildfire. By afternoon, the story had transformed with each retelling, growing more dramatic with every iteration. In the ER, they said Calloway had performed surgery with a butter knife. In pediatrics, they claimed he'd used a straw from the soda fountain. In oncology, nurses whispered that the old James, the brilliant surgeon they'd missed, had finally returned. Security footage from the cafeteria cameras was pulled up on computer screens throughout the hospital, staff crowding around to watch the incredible intervention. Medical students analyzed his technique, pointing out the precision of his movements despite the crude tools at his disposal. Nurses who had once worked with James nodded in recognition. This was the surgeon they remembered, confident and decisive when it mattered most. That evening, James sat in the ICU waiting room, having changed into fresh scrubs and his old white doctor's coat retrieved from the back of his office closet. Felt oddly right to be wearing it again after so long. He'd spent the afternoon assisting the ICU team with Walter's case, providing the details of his emergency procedure and helping monitor the patient's recovery. Susan Simmons approached, her eyes red from crying but her expression transformed from the terror of earlier hours. She sat beside him, hands twisting a tissue. "Dr. Kaplan told me everything," she said. "They said Walter would have died without you. That what you did was." She searched for the word. "Miraculous." "Not miraculous," James corrected gently. "Just necessary. The right intervention at the right time. Walter's allergic to sesame. We didn't know there was sesame oil in the dressing." Her hands trembled. "We've been married 41 years. I wasn't ready to lose him." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "You were there for a reason. God put you there." James didn't correct her theological interpretation of his cafeteria lunch break. He'd seen enough of life and death to respect the frameworks people used to make sense of the randomness of existence. Instead, he asked, "How is he doing?" "They're keeping him sedated tonight, but they expect a full recovery." Her voice broke slightly. "Dr. Kaplan said there's no sign of brain damage. That we have you to thank for that." She gripped his hand suddenly. "Thank you for not hesitating. Thank you for being the kind of doctor who sees what needs doing and just does it." Her words struck him profoundly. For 3 years, hesitation had defined him. Fear of another failure, another death on his conscience. Today, action had felt like coming home to himself. As James left the ICU, the difference in how the hospital staff regarded him was palpable. Nurses who had politely avoided his gaze for years now nodded respectfully. A passing surgeon, one who had turned away from him in the doctor's lounge just last week, stopped to shake his hand. "Heard what you did, Calloway. Impressive work." "Just lucky to be there," James replied, uncomfortable with the attention but undeniably affected by it. "Luck had nothing to do with it," the surgeon countered. "That was pure skill. We've missed that around here." For the first time in 3 years, James walked the hospital corridors with his head high. The sensation was bittersweet, knowing what tomorrow would bring. His moment of redemption would likely be short-lived once hospital administration got involved. Unauthorized surgery in the cafeteria? With a pocket knife? The paperwork alone would be a nightmare, let alone the potential liability issues. Because while the medical staff saw a hero, hospital administrator Richard Grayson, watching security footage from his office for the 3rd time, his face hardening with each viewing, saw something very different. The following morning, James arrived early at Memorial General. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying yesterday's events on an endless loop. After 3 years of emotional numbness, of going through the motions, he felt alive again, alert to every sensation. He'd stopped at his favorite coffee shop for the first time in months, exchanging actual conversation with the barista instead of his usual mumbled order. Most noticeably, he'd made a deliberate choice about his appearance. Instead of the casual attire he'd adopted in research, he wore a crisp button-down shirt and his best tie beneath his white doctor's coat, a stark contrast to the casual clothes he'd worn for the past 3 years. Something about yesterday had awakened his old identity, and he felt compelled to embrace it, regardless of what the day might bring. At precisely 9:15 a.m., James was heading toward his research lab to check on experiments he'd neglected yesterday when he spotted Richard Grayson marching toward him in the West Wing corridor. The 58-year-old administrator cut an imposing figure in his tailored charcoal suit, silver tie perfectly knotted, his silver hair immaculately groomed, his face set in lines of cold fury. "Calloway," Grayson called, his voice echoing down the sterile hallway. Several nurses at a nearby station turned to watch. A resident filling out charts pretended to focus on his paperwork while clearly eavesdropping. "A word. Now." James stopped, aware of the gathering audience. This confrontation, it seemed, would not happen behind closed doors as hospital disputes typically did. Grayson wanted witnesses, or perhaps he was simply too angry to wait until they reached his office. "I understand you performed surgery in my cafeteria yesterday," Grayson said, closing the distance between them, his voice low but intense. "With a pocket knife. I performed an emergency procedure on a patient in anaphylactic shock," James replied evenly. "The trauma team was unavailable. It was that or let him die." "That's not your call to make anymore," Grayson hissed, stepping closer. "You surrendered that right 3 years ago." From his suit jacket's inner pocket, he produced a document. James recognized it as his medical license, which Grayson had somehow obtained from hospital records. A chill ran through him as Grayson held it up like evidence in a prosecution. "You signed away your surgical privileges voluntarily after my wife died on your table," Grayson continued, his voice thick with barely contained emotion. "You acknowledged your judgment was compromised, that you weren't fit for surgical decision-making. The medical review cleared me of any negligence in Margaret's case," James said quietly, aware of the growing audience of hospital staff pausing in the corridor. "And yesterday's intervention was an emergency situation with no qualified personnel available. You think I care about technicalities?" Grayson's voice rose slightly, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You violated your contract. You have no surgical privileges here. You violated every protocol we have." "I saved a man's life," James said simply. "Just like you saved Margaret." Grayson spat the words, his knuckles whitening as his fist clenched around James's medical license, crumpling the document. "Your impulsiveness, your disregard for proper procedure, it's a pattern, Calloway." The hallway had gone completely silent now. A phlebotomist wheeling a blood cart stopped mid-corridor. 2 physicians paused their conversation. A group of medical students pressed themselves against the wall, wide-eyed at the confrontation between the young doctor in his white coat and the imposing administrator in his dark suit. "This," Grayson held up the crumpled license, his fist tightening around it, crushing it further for emphasis, "is finished. I've already contacted the state medical board. You're done practicing medicine at this or any other hospital." James felt a strange calm despite the public humiliation. "You don't have the authority to revoke my license." "I have friends on the board," Grayson replied coldly. "By the time I'm finished explaining how you endangered a patient with your cafeteria butchery, they'll be begging to take your license. And don't think that patient will protect you. Once their lawyer explains the liability issues, they'll be filing suit by week's end." "This isn't about yesterday," James said, the realization clarifying in his mind as he spoke. "This has always been about Margaret." The administrator's face flushed slightly. "Clean out your office by end of day," he said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Security will escort you out." With that, Grayson pushed the wadded license into James's chest pocket with enough force to make him step back. The administrator then continued down the hallway, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor, leaving James standing alone among shocked onlookers. Dr. Rebecca Chun approached from where she'd been watching the confrontation unfold. "He can't do that," she whispered, eyes darting to make sure Grayson was out of earshot. "He doesn't have the authority to revoke your license." He has enough influence to make it happen, James replied, removing the crumpled paper from his pocket and attempting to smooth it. And after Margaret. This isn't right, Chun insisted, her expression fierce despite her junior status. What you did yesterday saved Mr. Simmons's life. Everyone in this hospital knows it. Did you see the nurses' faces when Grayson was talking? No one believes you did anything wrong. James looked around at the sympathetic faces of his colleagues. A senior nurse nodded encouragingly. An orderly gave him a discreet thumbs up as he passed. Sometimes saving a life isn't enough, James said quietly. Not when there's history. An elderly physician James recognized as Dr. Harrison, the semi-retired former chief of surgery who had trained him during residency, stopped beside them. He'd witnessed the entire confrontation. In my 50 years of medicine, Harrison said, voice cracking with age but firm with conviction, I've never seen a clearer example of putting a patient first. Don't let him do this to you, James. Before James could respond, his pager suddenly beeped, a code he hadn't seen in years. The emergency board meeting notification. His pager shouldn't even have received such a code. He'd been removed from the surgical notification system 3 years ago. He looked up questioningly at Dr. Harrison, who offered a conspiratorial smile. I might have had the tech department reactivate your old codes. Meetings in 30 minutes. I suggest you attend. In his office, James methodically packed 3 years of research into cardboard boxes. Journals, notes, the small personal effects that had made this scientific exile bearable. His mind kept returning to the crumpled license now laid out on his desk, a symbolic destruction of everything he'd worked for. Despite Dr. Harrison's cryptic message and the emergency board meeting notification, James held few illusions about his future at Memorial General. Even if some board members sympathized with his actions, Grayson's influence was considerable. The administrator had spent years cultivating relationships with the hospital's major donors and had survived 3 changes of medical leadership. His vendetta against James now seemed complete. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca Chun, the resident from yesterday's emergency, stood nervously in the doorway. I heard what happened in the hallway, she said. Everyone's talking about it. Hospital politics, James replied tiredly. I knew there would be consequences. But not like this, she insisted, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. She glanced down the hallway before continuing, her voice dropping to a near whisper. After yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about something. About why a surgeon with your reputation would just stop operating. James continued packing his books. That's ancient history. So I looked up the case. Margaret Grayson's surgery. Chen's words stopped his movements. I accessed her medical records. James set down the book he was holding. That's a privacy violation, he warned. You could lose your residency for that. I know. Her expression was resolute, determined. But I found something strange. She produced a tablet from her lab coat, opening a file. These are your original surgical notes from that day, the ones you dictated immediately post-operation. James stared at the screen, uncomprehending. How did you get these? These aren't in the official record. The voice transcription system backs up to a separate server before final records are processed. IT doesn't purge those backups for 5 years. Chun swiped to another document. And these are the notes that appear in her official medical record. James compared them side by side, his blood running cold. Key details had been altered, subtle changes that painted a picture of negligence. His documented concerns about her unusual blood work were missing. His request for additional testing before proceeding had been deleted. Timestamps had been modified to suggest a delayed response to complications. Someone changed your notes after dictation but before they entered the official record, Chun said, her voice tight with indignation. And there's more. She opened another file. I found emails between Grayson and the former chief of surgery discussing your case review. Grayson pushed for a finding of negligence, but the evidence wouldn't support it. She scrolled to highlight a particularly damning exchange. Grayson, I want him held accountable. The review needs to find him at fault. Chief, The evidence doesn't support that conclusion, Richard. 3 independent reviewers found no deviation from standard of care. Grayson, find different reviewers. I don't care what it takes. Chief, I understand you're grieving, but I can't manufacture a finding of negligence when none exists. James sat heavily in his chair, a rush of emotions, vindication, anger, grief washing over him. All this time, I thought I might have missed something. I've replayed that surgery in my mind 1,000 times, questioning every decision. You didn't miss anything, Chun said firmly. The record was altered after the fact. Why are you showing me this? James asked, his voice rough with emotion. Chen's expression softened. Because what you did yesterday was the most impressive medical intervention I've ever witnessed. Because doctors like you shouldn't be pushed out of medicine by hospital politics. She paused, her professional demeanor slipping slightly to reveal personal conviction. And because my father died 10 years ago when his surgeon hesitated during a crisis. You didn't hesitate yesterday. Not for a second. Medicine needs doctors like you. James studied the young resident, seeing in her the idealism he'd once possessed. This could damage your career, getting involved like this. Some things matter more than career advancement, she replied simply. James's phone rang, an internal hospital extension. The caller ID showed Dr. Hoffman, the current chief of surgery. Calloway? Don't leave the building. The board has called an emergency session. They want you present in 30 minutes. Hoffman's tone was unreadable. Boardroom C, administration level. I'll be there, James replied, ending the call and looking back at Chun. The board meeting's happening now. I need to go. Chun nodded, handing him the tablet. Take this. All the evidence is there. She hesitated, then added, I made copies. Thank you, James said, the words inadequate for the risk she'd taken. Whatever happens in that meeting. Go, she interrupted with a smile. Make it count. Boardroom C was unusually full for an emergency session. The 12 members of Memorial General's governing board sat around the large mahogany table, their expressions grave. But the gallery seats lining the walls, normally empty during routine meetings, were filled with staff. James recognized nurses from various departments, residents, attending physicians, even members of the cafeteria staff where yesterday's emergency had unfolded. Richard Grayson sat at one end of the table, dark suit now slightly rumpled, his earlier confidence visibly shaken by the unexpected turnout. He adjusted his silver tie nervously as he scanned the crowded room. At the other end was a surprise. Walter Simmons in a wheelchair, still recovering but very much alive, accompanied by his wife Susan and a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit whom James didn't recognize. Dr. Sarah Chen, the formidable neurosurgeon who served as chair of the board, called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. We've convened regarding yesterday's incident in the hospital cafeteria and the subsequent administrative action taken this morning. Grayson leaned forward, straightening his posture. I've already handled this matter appropriately. You've exceeded your authority, Richard. Dr. Chun interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Terminating a physician and attempting to influence their state licensing are board matters, not administrative ones. The distinguished man beside Walter stood. He had Walter's same strong chin, but 30 years younger, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. I'm Senator Michael Simmons, Walter's son. I was in Washington when I received word that a doctor at this hospital saved my father's life under extraordinary circumstances, and was fired for it. Murmurs rippled through the room as the impact of this revelation settled. A state senator's father. James felt a twinge of unease at the political dimension suddenly added to his personal drama. I've had independent medical experts review the security footage, the senator continued. They confirm what every medical professional in this room already knows. Dr. Calloway performed flawlessly under impossible conditions. Had he not acted, my father would have died before your trauma team arrived. Dr. Hoffman, the current chief of surgery, cleared his throat. I feel I must speak. After witnessing this morning's confrontation in the West Corridor, I became concerned about the personal nature of the administrative response. Dr. Chun and I began reviewing past interactions between Administrator Grayson and Dr. Calloway. Rebecca Chun stepped forward, tablet in hand. With the board's permission, I've uncovered evidence suggesting tampering with medical records in the case of Margaret Grayson 3 years ago. Records that directly affected Dr. Calloway's surgical privileges and reputation. The room fell silent as Chun displayed the discrepancies on the boardroom screen, explaining the server backup system that had preserved the original dictation. She navigated through documents with practiced ease, highlighting the altered timestamps, deleted warnings, and finally, the damning email exchange. These alterations appear to have been made using Administrator Grayson's credentials, she concluded, and the emails clearly show attempts to manipulate the review process. All eyes turned to Grayson, whose face had gone pale. This is preposterous. She's violated HIPAA by accessing these records, and you're entertaining these accusations? We've already consulted hospital counsel, Dr. Sarah Chun replied. Given the evidence of potential falsification of medical records, they've advised a full investigation is warranted. The ethics of accessing those records will be addressed separately, but the content of those records cannot be ignored. This is a witch hunt, Grayson protested, rising halfway from his chair. Calloway has been manipulating you all. Actually, Senator Simmons interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. Dr. Calloway appears to be the only person who didn't know about this meeting. My office contacted the board directly after learning how the hospital treated the physician who saved my father's life. The senator leaned forward, his expression hardening. Let me be clear about something. My father is alive today only because Dr. Calloway was willing to act when others couldn't. The state provides this hospital with $17 million in annual funding. That funding depends on proper governance and ethical leadership. If this board allows personal vendettas to override patient care, I'll be forced to reconsider that relationship. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Board members exchanged glances, the calculus of their decision visibly shifting. Dr. Sarah Chun addressed the board. We have 2 motions before us. First, the immediate reinstatement of Dr. James Calloway with full surgical privileges, pending completion of a standard surgical reentry program. Second, administrative leave for Richard Grayson, pending investigation of medical record tampering. She called for the vote. One by one, board members pressed buttons on the electronic voting system. The results appeared on the large screen, unanimous on both counts. The motions pass, Dr. Chun announced. Dr. Calloway, on behalf of Memorial General, I offer both our congratulations and our apologies. Your actions yesterday exemplify the highest ideals of our profession. The room erupted in applause. Nurses, doctors, and staff members who had stood silently during the proceedings now showed their support openly. James felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in fortune. The weight of 3 years lifting from his shoulders so abruptly, he felt almost disoriented by its absence. Walter Simmons wheeled himself toward James, stopping directly in front of him. A bandage still covered his throat where the emergency airway had been placed, but his eyes were clear and alert. Can't talk much with this thing, he rasped, pointing to his bandaged throat, but needed to thank you in person. He extended his hand, which James took, feeling the firm grip of the older man. Senator Simmons approached next. Doctor, when you're ready to perform surgery again, I hope you'll consider my father as your patient for any follow-up procedures. I'd trust those hands anywhere after what I've seen. As security personnel arrived to escort Grayson from the building, the administrator paused beside James. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by a bitter resignation. This isn't over, Grayson said quietly. James looked at the man who had nearly destroyed his career, who had successfully sidelined him for 3 years, and felt an unexpected surge of compassion. I truly am sorry about Margaret, he said. I did everything I could for her. Something flickered in Grayson's eyes, perhaps the first acknowledgement that his grief had been misdirected all this time. Without another word, he allowed himself to be led away. Dr. Sarah Chun approached as the room began to clear. "We'll need you to testify during the investigation," she said. "But more importantly, we need you back in the OR. The surgical reentry program is just a formality in your case." "I'm not sure I'm ready," James admitted, voicing the doubt that still lingered despite everything. "What you did in that cafeteria says otherwise," she replied, her tone both kind and firm. "Sometimes we need to be thrown into the deep end to remember we can swim." 1 month later, James Calloway stood in operating room 3, gloved hands held before him as nurses completed the surgical prep. The room felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like returning to a childhood home after years away. The beeping monitors, the cool air, the focused energy of a surgical team waiting for his direction. All of it felt right in a way nothing had for 3 years. In the observation deck above, Walter Simmons sat with his family, watching the surgeon who had saved his life with nothing but instinct, courage, and a ballpoint pen. Walter's follow-up procedure was minor but necessary, and he had insisted that Dr. Calloway perform it. Rebecca Chun, now officially requesting assignment to James's service, stood across the table as assistant. "Nervous?" she asked quietly as the anesthesiologist finished his work. James checked the surgical monitors, surveyed the properly laid-out instruments so different from his improvised tools in the cafeteria, and found his answer. "No," he replied with certainty. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The investigation into Grayson's actions continued, but the hospital had already begun healing. And as James made the first precise incision of his surgical rebirth, he understood something profound. Sometimes saving a patient means saving yourself. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to remember why you became a doctor in the first place. And sometimes, when protocols and paperwork threaten to bury the human heart of medicine, it takes a crisis in a cafeteria to remind us all what truly matters.